Hello, today's lesson is on the water rights for the state of Colorado. This is kind of a compilation and a shortened version of years and years of law. You should know that water law in Colorado is a big deal, and water is very important in Colorado, and so it's important that we as agriculturalists understand it. The quote on the screen comes from a guy named John Gunther, who was an American journalist and writer, and he said, if you touch water in the West, then you touch everything because water touches virtually every industry and every part of life. The picture below is actually of Blue Mesa Reservoir. Blue Mesa Reservoir is the largest reservoir in Colorado and storage of drinking and irrigation water. In the state of Colorado, the public actually owns the water. And so changes in water actually have to be made by legislative law. And that includes every natural stream, tributary, groundwater, and it all is subject to appropriation. We really can't understand water rights until you fully understand the water cycle. And I know this seems a little third gradish, but it's important for you to review and kind of evaluate in your brain just a little bit. Things start with precipitation coming from the sky in the form of rain, sleet, snow, hail. And we see that some of that water goes down under the surface into groundwater, and some of it stays on the surface in the forms of lakes, streams, and rivers. I used this diagram because I really like how it shows infiltration. And what we don't realize is that when water goes through layers of sand and rock and clay and all these other things, um, that it actually cleans it. So it acts as somewhat of a biological filter. It's also important to understand what groundwater is called. And in the case of large accumulations, we call that groundwater aquifers. When we drill wells to access water, we are drilling into aquifers and groundwater sources. The surface runoff that comes off the mountains can evaporate straight out of those places, or it is sometimes taken up by plants. Pardon me. And so when plants take up water, they actually release a large amount of what they take up in a process called transpiration, not transportation, transpiration. And that water also goes back into the environment. All of this water evaporates up, condenses in the sky, and returns to us in precipitation. In order for you to get the legal right to use water in Colorado that is a product of that water cycle, you have to have a water right decree. And so anytime you divert any water from the ground or surface or stream, that water right decree will tell you the location of the diversion, where the water comes from, the amount that can be diverted, how it can be stored, and what priority it is. When you establish water rights, or when you really think about them, you have to understand the phrase first in time, first in right. The water rights structure actually dates back in the state of Colorado to the mining era. And what would happen is miners would find minerals in a portion of the stream, and then they would go to the office, the mine office, if you will. I don't know what it was called. And they would actually make a claim on that chunk of stream. And that meant then that they owned the right to all of the minerals in that portion of the stream. And that was really our first water rights. We've shifted that and we've translated that to use the first to develop a permanent water rights system. But the thing that has really stayed is this idea that those older rights, those rights that were placed first, have the first right to use. So, for example, if you have a water right that was decreed in 1985, that's fairly recent. But if you have one that was decreed in 1900, that would take precedence over it because it was first in time. So it is first in right. Within the water rights system in Colorado, rights are given a specific priority. Senior rights are the very first rights or early rights that were decreed on a specific stream or ground system, and junior rights are more recent, filed on the same system. When the water runs short and a process is followed where you put a call on the stream, those senior rights have priority over junior rights. One of the interesting facts about the state of Colorado is that the decision of how many water rights were available was made during a time when there was more moisture in the state than there has been ever since. So for most people agree that water rights in Colorado are actually over allocated, meaning the state of Colorado has sold more rights or decreed more rights than there is actually available on a given year. We know that we are at the mercy of the natural levels of snowfall and precipitation. And as a headwater state, it's really important that we understand that that number will never be the same. However, when they allocated it, it was relatively high. And so it's fairly common where a situation arises where there's not enough water in the water source for all of the water rights to be honored. And when that happens, whoever feels like they're not getting their water rights puts a call on the ditch, if you will. And what that means is that state hired officials then issue this call and make sure that all of the right holders or the decree holders are getting their set amount of water in the order that it is decreed. And so until somebody puts a call on the ditch, for the most part, those people that are on that ditch and maintaining it and using the water for beneficial use, particularly in agriculture, work together kind of in a teamwork environment as much as they can. But it's a little tricky because the water rights don't always follow the natural flow of the stream. And we'll look at a diagram about that in a minute. Until we get there, though, you should also know that in Colorado, water rights are private property rights, and they are private property rights that do not have to stay tied to the property. The owner can sell, lease, or rent these rights separate from their property rights. And you can actually change things about certain water rights in water court if needed. There is a clause in that law also that's called the use it or lose it clause, which basically says that in a period of 5 years, if water is not being put to beneficial use, the owner of that water right can lose it. Water rights can only be used for the beneficial purpose stated in the decree. All other uses are illegal. This definitely comes into play in some water rights, like for well permits, maybe saying this can be used for residential use but not for irrigation, and different things like that. In addition, it's worth noting that water flow can't be tampered with from its original path. So if you do something to physically move the path of a stream or divert it without the consent of the court, that could alter the return flows and affect the people downstream. So you can't do that. Water right owners also have the right and duty to maintain their ditches. So everyone who receives water from that ditch should work together in the maintenance of it, which means that they have to have access to the property that ditch goes across to keep the ditches clean and in good repair. 1973 was a pivotal year in water law because this was when Colorado legislature adopted a law that we commonly refer to as in-stream flow. And basically this said that the state of Colorado will maintain a certain amount of flow, a certain amount of water rights to maintain flow in the river. And this was done to help maintain the natural wildlife and make sure that we didn't at any point ruin the habitat for different wildlife, plants, fish, and recreational use in the Colorado River. This was controversial at the time because sometimes leaving those rights or returning those rights to the river might mean that other people with water rights don't get to use that water. But it did make a substantial difference in the reintroduction of several major fish species in Colorado, and continues to make sure that we can do what we need to in protecting natural habitats. When we measure water, we do that in water flow, which is measured in cubic feet per second. And then we also measure water in 1 acre foot. So as you read irrigation statements or water rate statements, you might see some of this terminology. 1 acre foot basically means that there's a foot of water across an entire football field. And so you might have your amount of water measured in that. We're going to look at an example now so you can kind of put this into practice. We have kind of an imaginary land here of water rights. You can see 5 different ranches on this same ditch. On each of these places, we have an established date, meaning how old the rights are, how many shares they have, and whether they are senior or junior rights. The water flows down the stream from the top of the screen to the bottom. And that's something we want to talk about because sometimes the people with the most senior rights are at the bottom of the ditch. And that's really comes into play when you put a call on the ditch, because that means that those people on the top part of the ditch can't draw their irrigation right, but they just have to let it flow by because of the legal order that water is decreed in. And so pay attention to a couple of things here. We have the established dates. We also have which ones are senior rights versus junior rights. Senior rights are honored first. And then we have those total numbers. So if you add all of this up, this creek that we're looking at in our imaginary land has 65 shares allocated. But we're in Colorado, and so lots of years we're in a drought. So what would happen, the question becomes, if this year there was only 30 shares available because of the drought? Who would get their water and who would not? The first thing you kind of do is look at senior versus junior rights, and then you're going to put them in a numerical order. So take just a minute, figure out what order you think that would be and how this would work. And here's what would actually happen. We first take a look at senior rights. So we know that Allen's Angus Ranch, Harry's Herefords, and Brian's Brahman cattle all have those senior rights, so they're going to be honored first. When we put those in order of oldest to youngest, remember first in time, first in right, then that tells us that Brian's Brahman cattle has the oldest shares. Those would be honored first at 22 shares. Next in line is Harry's Herefords, established in 1908. Those would be honored at 5 shares. And then finally, Allen's Angus Ranch would be next in line, but we don't have enough to honor all his shares. So if there's really only 30 shares of water available on the creek, Allen would get 3 of his 8 shares, but that's all. And the other 2 ranches would not receive any of their water rights at all. This would probably be a little tricky in real life because Brian's is at the very bottom of the ditch. And there's some irony to that, but it truly is water law, and it's the way that it would be enforced, that those people at the top of the ditch would have to just watch the water go by. Now, occasionally in times of drought, farmers and ranchers will work together and try to honor just a little bit of everybody's shares. But sometimes that doesn't go well because people begin stealing water and taking matters into their own hand. We hear stories all throughout history of in the West, head gates, which is the place where the water comes through and is measured, actually having to be locked shut, except for the state ditch writer, so that people don't come in and change the diversion boxes to give themselves more water. So in a field like agriculture, where water truly determines your success in terms of pasture and crops, the debates get fairly heated. It's important to realize that while water is very important agriculturally, there's also legal precedent set. And so there are so many water situations and water discrepancies involving the law that there's actually a special water court in Colorado to deal with those. I think it's really important for you to understand water rights, particularly if you're going to be a resident in Colorado and especially Plateau Valley someday, because the best way to make sure your neighbors stay neighborly is to honor the fair and legal way to manage water rights. Hopefully this was helpful, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel, and thanks for coming. Have a good day.